This is Talking Hardcore, the podcast for people who love hardcore history.
You study history because it allows us to understand the present and prepare for the future.
I'm not trolling.
And I love it.
I'm just
here for
pointing out where they're wrong.
The Talking Hardcore podcast is presented by Ace Industrial Solutions. Are you in need of skilled trade professionals for your next project? Look no further.
Cheers. Matt,
Gin.
you got a drink?
Yeah, I got a
Jack?
gin and tonic right here,
Okay.
or a gin and ginger beer actually.
Okay, so let's just say gin and juice so you sound more manly.
Sipping on gin and
All right, and what are you
It's really
drinking, Scott?
rum. Straight.
Rum. I'm having an old fashioned. Jack's drinking whiskey. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for
Cheers.
Jack making another book club event.
Yep, and this shit's poison and it'll kill you.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
So a wife is
Oh,
crazy.
well, that was from, I was quoting, what was that? God, Role Models.
Mm.
When he was drinking like
Okay.
the
Deep Pull. That was a funny movie.
Minotaur.
Have you ever seen that movie, by the way?
It was so
God, that's a funny movie. These two dudes end up having to mentor kids that are into live action role playing, live action LARPing, you know?
Yep, LARPing.
Oh, man,
Yeah.
is it funny. So Sean Austin Scott or whatever from Stifler
And Paul Rudd.
and Paul Rudd
Yep.
are mentoring a bunch of dudes that run around with wooden swords being dorks. It's very funny. Okay,
I think I've seen that movie.
Is it good?
are you ready to talk about the book?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Jack, you ready? We're just going to engage with you directly here, Jack. So
Because there's
if you
nobody.
want to jump on stage and talk, you can, but you don't have to. All right. So, INDEH by Eve Ball, recommended by the one and only Dan Carlin, which is why I think we got such a big turnout today.
Yeah.
We got the same turnout we usually get.
Yeah, it
which
didn't
is
hurt.
awesome.
It didn't hurt. I'm just glad that we get to have a fun conversation. Okay. Let's go first. A recap of the book. INDEH by Eve Ball is a book where today we're doing part one, the first half of the book.
Would it kill you to say INDEH?
I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation.
So there'd be INDEH, which means the living, and INDEH is the dead. Not indeed.
So it's INDEH.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Grammar police are
Well,
Anyway.
come on. At least get it right.
okay. INDEH.
Close enough.
We'll go with INDEH. Okay, it's a book about the Apache at the end of the Indian Wars, and it was written by Eve Ball, who interviewed the last surviving members of the Apache tribe, primarily Doc Lugee, who was the son of Jew, is
Ho.
one way to say it,
Or ho.
or Hull,
Or whoa.
and the nephew of Geronimo, and was with Geronimo when he died. So, very interesting take. Well,
Yeah,
Jack,
I mean,
if you
my-
want to
my-
join the stage, I think you can just hit join stage.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
pop
then you
into
can
the
have a
speaker,
conversation with us.
All you got to do is hit join stage, I believe. I don't think we have it limited to anybody. I mean, if we did, we would have kicked Scott off.
Be my guest.
You morose motherfucker.
You want to roll
You look
this
like
with
somebody just
you-
shitting your cereal.
You want to run this without me? Go ahead.
God, like that would be hard. You do nothing but show up and talk.
Right on.
That's the whole point of the
hard part
podcast.
is me.
That's the whole point of the podcast.
The hard part's all me. Editing, finding Matt's making theme music for us.
I happen to think that financially back.
That's the sponsor, not you.
He's getting his money's worth out of all of us, Scott. Like, don't worry.
Yeah, Dan Carlin
I
is on your episode. Your company got a plug in countries all over the world thanks to Dan Carlin being on the podcast.
Yeah.
You could wear an Ace shirt to Jamaica, and people might be like, "Oh, I heard about you on Talking Hardcore with Dan Carlin on that episode."
Yeah, man.
Well, I wasn't trying to do Jamaican accent because I know I can't.
Oh, I should have.
Okay, so Jack said it didn't work, but I think he just didn't want it to work because he does not want it to be talking. So Jack, just type if you want to come on, or if you want to say something. Either way. Okay, so INDEH, right? Okay, so basically, this whole book is just a primary source bonanza. She interviewed all of these Apaches and just puts their accounts into some kind of chronological order.
Or tries to.
It's very hard sometimes to follow exactly where we are timeline wise because she switches back and forth during the different narrators. I feel like it would be easier to read this if I had a spreadsheet or like a flow chart that showed the different people and I could follow their narratives. Like, it's a little tricky.
Yeah, but at one point in the book, she's talking about Ho, and then all like him dying, like falling off his horse and dying.
Yep.
And then the next paragraph, she's talking about him doing like a
because it's a different person's perspective, and that's why I had to start paying more attention to when she says this speaker. So it's hard to keep track of them all. But also, great book.
Yeah.
Because you've got to preserve these primary sources.
Well, the other thing that was very interesting to me, and I'm only halfway through the book, but the interesting thing is how the U.S. government was telling the officers that were going to be dealing with the Native Americans and what the policy changes were. So, like the first guy, what was his name?
Which one? There's a
call.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Anyway, the first guy was a jerk, and he wanted them all moved to this like really crappy, was it sand something?
Yep.
And then the next guy was more
Bartlett or something like that.
Yeah, Bartlett was more.
He was good. He was their Indian agent, and he was really represented their interests.
And then the next guy was
Dick.
Yeah, I mean it's just interesting how but the orders, they even said, well, my orders are to make sure that, you have here's the food you're supposed to be getting, here's the money you're supposed to be getting,
which we'll come back to because I find that interesting. All right, Matt, but let's jump to you. What thoughts do you have about the first half of this book? And let's get into it.
Well, yeah, first of all, I mean, I think you said it, George, and this is remarkable, just why Dan probably recommended it. It leaps to mind as one of the few very valuable primary sources we have into just a probably otherwise largely illuminated portion of history in general, especially American history. Let's hear it from all sides, right? And just diving into the Apache side of things, their culture is just, you can see why young boys, Dan Carlin, everybody who reads this just falls in love with that lifestyle, right? Not only do you have the warriors, but you have really the peaceful village life in a way. They have the support of their families and rural farming and just growing crops, but still going out on raids. And it is very exciting. And it's just to think that this is how America was for so long. It's just
everywhere. If you go back far enough,
recommended it, and I'm glad we read it for the book club tonight.
Me too. But if you go back far enough, Matt, that's everywhere.
It is everybody, and that's why I like it too, because I love human prehistory, and it's just so hard to find any real about it. But you have it. Like, this is a Stone Age civilization right here, and we have incredible records of them thanks to this woman and others.
People were alive from that era 80 years ago. Yeah. Less than 80 years ago, 60 years ago.
Yeah,
that's pretty.
And that's one thing I have marked crazy here. I have a few things marked, and it's.
Go ahead. We'll go through your notes, and then we'll get into mine.
We had no written language, and were forced to remember what were told.
So they
huge,
structured,
man. Huge.
Right. And so when he's talking about it, he's talking about how important that was, right? How they if you told one lie in something like that, you were never trusted again, because they had to have
the same thing
rigid
as falsifying an entry in a history book. Yeah.
Yep. You had to have rigid structure for truth telling for that. Otherwise, you were going to lose a lot.
The training and the discipline and the reverence for stories, for history passed down in the oral tradition from one generation to the next. It bonds a society together. It has all the things that you just talked about, where like every word is important to remember, just the same. And to hear these stories that are ages old is just chilling, man. I mean, it's just so chilling.
And then you have people nowadays that want to dismiss oral histories as though they can't be relied upon.
You read that passage, and it seems like you're talking about a barbarian culture, but when you really dive into it, it's actually much more advanced. Because easy is it
Yep.
Look something up on this or just to write it down, but we
Mhm.
have to remember it. Every person, every member of your tribe is a repository. Those who receive the stories.
And the
Take them
people who
seriously.
were bad at it didn't get to reproduce.
If our civilization collapsed tomorrow and nobody had their
Mhm.
bones to refer to, like how many people could restart human civilization? These people could restart their own culture, every single one of them, because they all received those stories.
True. Although,
And I
mean,
think that going back, just to kind of get it wackadoodle here for a minute.
let's do it. It
I
might
think
get
this
weird.
is the way it was anyways, just because there was no written language for so long. But let's talk like possibly the pre-Diluvian cultures that existed in maybe North America, and we're going to dive into some grand hand talk territory here. But a society, if you're a civilization that had experienced a total collapse because, because of some natural catastrophe, and you realize that writing things down on pieces of paper or what wasn't useful anymore. The only way you could really pass on history and culture and knowledge of technology or whatever you want to do, restart your civilization, was to make every person a computer in that regard. Every person a record of your own history.
Well, there were tribes that wrote stuff down, right?
Okay, yeah, sure.
But I think the Apaches were probably not one of them because they were nomads, right? If you're traveling the way they did, constantly moving and chasing game, tablets, paper, right? That's all stuff you have to carry.
This shit's heavy.
It's heavy. Yeah. You have to have the resources. Even before European contact, it does not sound like they were doing really well, right? It's a tough life where they chose to live, which is why they were so hard to conquer anyway, because it made them hard as shit. But Jack put a little voice memo here. We're going to press this and see what it says. Okay, I think he did it by accident. Don't worry, Jack. We got you. All right, so, but that is an interesting thing too, because Matt, not only were you talking about if they had a civilization collapse, by the time they were running into the Mexicans, and the Americans, they had just been through a civilization collapse a couple hundred years ago from smallpox.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. 80
to
90% of all First Nation people were killed off by disease, largely smallpox. Yeah, 80 to 90%. I mean, that's something we can't imagine.
Right. And that's why, one, it was so easy for the Americans to take all of North America. And the Spanish, if you think about it, look at how hard the Spanish had it before that.
Sure, they had to fight
and that
with
was
swords
as they were dying. Right.
Yeah. Whereas,
but by the time Americans got to the Apache, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it was the invisible agent that opened the gates of the castle, following conquerors.
Right. It made it so that instead of having something like Rome had with Europe, where maybe Rome was in charge, but those peoples were still there and they were just kind of brought into the fold, the land was mostly empty because so many Native Americans had died.
And then you had to bring people in to work the land, so they brought in Africans, right, who were resistant to the disease, and that a lot of the slave trade came from.
Right.
And
or
that created
even
cultures that still in this day.
Right. Or even just the pilgrims and the settlers who were going out there to make it themselves.
They were just giving away land, died on that land from smallpox.
Right. But I mean,
in my town of Port Angeles, Washington, they were building a marina, and they found this grave of First Nation people who died from disease. It's like right here. It's a big deal. There's a whole thing about it here.
That's crazy. And then, when you think about it, Matt, is nature abhors a vacuum, right?
It does.
Evolution doesn't allow vacuums. Okay, species move in, other animals of the same species move in. It's just the way nature works.
Well, that's why we had the theory is that's why we had so many buffalo.
Right.
It's because there was so many Native Americans had died off
that the buffalo population soared.
Yep, because they had no natural.
So it wasn't normally that high. Right. It wasn't normally 30 to 60 million, like when the Europeans finally got out west. And they're like, holy shit.
Yeah.
But it was only like that because so many Native Americans had died.
Yep.
And the other thing is it totally changed all their cultures. there was a lot of tribes of Native Americans that were actually settled and farmers. But when so many people died, and then there's all these buffalo, they're like, well, I'm not going to farm. I can just follow these buffalo and shoot one every once in a while, and I'm living high on the hog.
Yep. And then we're all eating.
And you know what? That sounds genius to me. Like, that's a nice way to make a living.
Animals know
Better than
the land. I mean, they're so attuned to that. You learn from the animal as you hunt them, right? About how to live in that environment, right?
Well, and they'll take you to the water. They'll take you to the water.
Mhm.
They know where the water's at.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Let's find here. Jack said, I can say from anecdotal experience of being a through hiker of how living outside affects the cultures of how stories and words of mouth is super important. On the trail, you get trail named, and who you are known as is a story of itself. People who are built bullshit are easy found out and shunned. I can see that.
Wow,
Yep.
That's a great point.
Great.
That's a great point. Those kind of things where you're out there and you're actually doing stuff, right? It's harder for people to bullshit. That's why cities are led to more, well, to psychopaths and sociopaths being able to thrive better. Because there's a certain percentage of humans, this is what I read anyway, certain percentage of humans are going to be psychopaths or sociopaths. But in tribal societies, they're outcast and shunned. So they don't even get to reproduce, right?
Yeah.
But in cities, there's so many people that it's easier for them to hide.
Yeah.
Because there's an anonymity.
I see it as being fewer immediate consequences. Yeah. You can say anything, be anyone. You can, what's the equivalent of good advice in a city? Directions. Oh, hey, sir, can you tell me how to get to blah, blah, blah? Sure, you go down 3 blocks. Well, I'm just going to mess with somebody or I don't know, and I'm going to lie to make myself look good. And then I send you on the wrong path or, committing crimes or whatever. You can disappear to that vast
anonymity
population or be anyone. Whereas in a small tribal society, you are just by your character, absolutely.
You have to
and
be.
the things you do and your value to the tribe is incredibly important.
Because the whole tribe relies on everybody. Okay.
Yeah, if you lie, if you're weak, it's not just maybe just about.
And what happens if you get shunned?
Truthfulness.
And if you get shunned, you don't get to reproduce, and
I'm
probably
all about
die.
that, man. I am all about laws being enforced by cultural impetus and call it, for lack of a better word, pressure, rather than just some third-party force coming down and saying this is the law of the land. We're going to enforce it blindly for all people. I mean,
and it's important.
Having law be blind for all people is a good thing in a certain regard, but when you have your peers, when you want to be of value, when you don't want to mess up for your tribe, when you want to be helpful and truthful and honest, that is much more of a motivation to not commit crimes than is being sent to prison. It really is.
Deterrence is not that effective.
So, but that what you're saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah.
No. What Jack was saying reminded me of like that guy that killed. God, what was it? Anyway, I'm terrible with names and I forgot to take notes. But the one guy that killed. The guy said, "Don't come any closer if you want any trouble."
Right.
He shot up. Just gave a warning shot. And the other guy shot him.
Right.
And the guy that shot what's his face ended up shunning himself because he murdered.
No. Yes.
Yeah.
But he shot at somebody who shot at him.
Yeah, I know. But
I think what the author thought is he wasn't shunning himself for shooting the guy. He was shunning himself for not speaking up right away.
Yeah.
And not having the balls to say to that guy's mom, "No, I shot him."
Yeah.
And letting the other guy stay quiet and take the fault.
But that's why he was,
he shunned himself.
Yeah.
That was the story. The guy walked off and roamed the land alone.
Yep.
And eventually just died. And they found his skeleton.
Yep.
One of the things that I did find really interesting from the book, though, Matt, is the stories. You see that these really are like just like it's a great way to illustrate that they are just like everybody else, right? When you read these stories, you hear him talk about mistakes. Dr. Louis talk about mistakes that he made when he was young, and impetus things he did as a child, just like a regular European child would do. Here they are fighting for their lives and warring, and he's running off doing dumb shit with his friend because they want to be grown ups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay,
Yeah.
well, that's relatable.
Yep, for sure.
You know,
It totally
kids
is.
all do that, even in trying times, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
It just depends on what you're leading them towards.
right. This really brought up to me, this whole book, though, is really just making me think about Dan's Lost Cause podcast. Why we love a lost cause, right? The 300, Geronimo. They never had an effing chance, right? And they knew it. That's why they called themselves the INDEH. INDEH? INDEH. The dead.
We're all dead
In the
from
book,
day one.
he explains
Live
that
accordingly.
the Apaches called themselves the INDEH, the dead, and the white people, the INDEH, which was the living. So they knew their culture was dead.
Like it, George.
Yeah.
Good job.
And you know what? I don't know any way they could have saved it. I can't think of a world.
Fanaticism,
Mhm.
that immediately calls to mind in Ghost of the Ostfront, where the average Russian soldier was flinging himself into combat with the grim abandon of one already dead because they knew
Right.
their
Right.
land. It didn't matter. Their life didn't matter. They were there to take bullets for someone else to get through. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
when you were faced with such an enemy, you have to abandon self. And that's what they did.
Yeah. Well, and even then, right? I mean, when you get to the point where Geronimo surrenders, I mean, it was either that or they'd never see their families again, and they just all live out in the wild for, forever,
Or until they were killed.
until they were caught, which maybe would have never happened.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
We're getting into sad stuff now. I mean, maybe that's more
Well,
towards the end of the first half. But I'd like
Right.
to just give them props. So as far
Mhm.
as the rating, I have a couple passages marked here. Knives
do
were
it.
distributed next, and a second mule load of ammunition. So they liked mule, they liked clothing, things were useful. But when we get to the gold and the silver that the Mexicans were
Right.
mining, first of all, they weren't allowed to touch the gold. But but silver they can, like, that's okay. You know what I mean? Like, that is not
Right.
their rules. But they didn't like the Mexicans mining the earth because it caused earthquakes, they believed, and they were afraid of earthquakes.
It
Makes
made their
sense.
god
Mining,
mad.
collapsing.
Mhm.
Yeah. But the last mule load had consisted of 2 huge cowhide bags full of the yellow metals that the white-eyed. When they were empty before my father, he was indignant. He asked who had been so foolish as to bring that stuff back from our raid. Didn't we know that bullets made of either were worthless? So they're interested in practical things, right? And also, when we get to scalping, they didn't start the scalping. They did it in retaliation, or sometimes they took one scalp for a traditional dance. Right. But they say that they didn't practice the scalping. The Mexicans started it, or White Eyes started it. So why do they hate it so much?
Right. But maybe it was a different tribe. Right, that's the thing that's hard to remember too. It's Doc Lukey when he's talking about he's talking about not just the Apache. He's talking about his little tribe of Apache.
That's a good point.
They differentiate each other so much that it's really hard to follow.
Yeah.
Right, and
the Bendokahe and
the Neche or whatever. I can't even pronounce them all, but it's really hard to follow that. Right, and I believe that he's right. They probably didn't start the scalping, but we don't know who did. But we do know that the Mexicans and sometimes even the Americans put bounties on scalps. Right.
Yeah.
And that only escalates. But this is what happens because all these rumors were flying around about the Apache torturing and everything. And Doc Lukey says, we didn't do that. That was all blown out of proportion. And maybe it was. Who knows? One side says one thing, one side says the other. I don't know where the truth is.
Yeah.
But you've got to hear both sides. Go ahead, Matt.
Remember in your cover when we were talking about the Tears episode last time, we were talking about how the Apaches were really some of the ultimate warriors that anyone from the colonization side of things encountered, and so that may be why it's so fascinating, and that let's not feel so bad for some people who were badasses in their time and went down fighting. You know what I mean? So that was great, and there's a little bit about their prowess here. The Mexicans had always insisted that a pistol is a better weapon than a bow and arrow. but this was when there were only muzzle loading guns. If an Apache
Right.
with
Yeah.
a bow and arrow had to fight a Mexican with a gun, the Apache
Mhm.
lured the Mexican to fire both his rifle and his pistol. If he had
Mhm.
both, then the Mexican had to reload before firing again. While the Mexican was
Yep.
reloading, the Apache would run in, firing arrows as he came. If he missed, he was killed. But I knew men who could put 7 arrows in the air before the first one that was fired fell to the earth.
Right. Right. And this is why the invention of the revolver,
And the repeating
the
rifle.
repeating
Game
rifle,
changer.
was
Yeah.
why the Geronimo wasn't going to be able to win.
Or the howitzers or cannon. Like
Well, cannon's not as big a deal.
Howitzers.
Howitzers.
Yeah.
Cannon is a big show, but really not
Right.
that effective in land warfare when you're fighting a
Yeah,
small
but
group of
multiple
people.
repeating, instantly firing
Yep.
rounds is what you're talking about, George, right? Yeah.
Okay, so Jack, I love this. I was actually going to bring this up. It says, y'all have any thoughts on the baby kid stealing, raising captives as your own, increasing your numbers? I absolutely do, Jack. I'm glad you asked. I am anti-baby stealing.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, Scott, but I'm going to come out hard on this issue.
Why would I want that
Right.
headache?
So the thing is, native tribes or tribes of people do this or have done this all the time, because sometimes that was the only way to grow your numbers.
Yeah.
And what's the best resource you could have? It's not a buffalo. It's
No.
another human.
Yep.
Because that's another thinking, smart person that can add to the tribe. And they got pretty good at assimilating those people. There's all kinds of stories of kidnapped white people and Mexican people who went native, basically, and ended up.
are.
And you can understand that, because that kind of lifestyle will be alluring to some people.
Dances with wolves.
Yeah, but sometimes that's kind of true, right?
Sure.
But also, sometimes Native Americans were brutal and were killing babies. And listen, you steal the kid, the parents are going to be pissed.
Yeah.
And how are you ever going to have peace with a society where their whole fundamental culture requires them to raid, and part of that raiding is taking kids so that they don't die out? Now, maybe that wouldn't have been as common before the smallpox, but it was inevitable now.
Yeah. And what do you, or if you kill the kid's parents, what are you going to do with you take the kid.
Well, often they would kill the dad.
Yeah.
Kill the dad, take the wife. And now that gets to another point later in the book where the one kid and the mom get captured and taken into the camp, and they were a different type of Native American. They get taken into the camp, and I think it was Jew or Ho, right? I think that's who it was. Basically, said, okay, he picked his wife that he wanted out of the captives.
Yeah.
Then the next guy in charge got to pick his wife, and then the next guy got to pick his wife. And then because that wife had a kid, then that dude raised that kid, his stepson, to be his son.
Yeah.
And the kid that talked about that, really, the way he's talking, because it's this Charlie Smith story. He's talking, and he was talking about, like, so when the mom takes him, or when he gets chosen with the mom to go to this guy, she says, now you do what he says. You don't ever look like you're not happy. You do all these things, right? And it sounds like he starts to really love the guy. That's a thing.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make it okay to steal people's kids.
Yeah.
It does not.
No. So now here we go. I
Jack's
like
popped
this.
up again with an thought.
Jack, thank you so much. This is great. What was also common is marriage with neighboring bands and forming a family bond to defend each other.
Yep.
There's an interesting mention of how incest and inbreeding was a non-factor for these people. That's because they knew that it could be a problem.
Yep.
So they had strict cultural rules against it. So the one story.
This is clan.
Go ahead.
No, and what they were doing, Jack, and I think this was mentioned, like Eve Ball threw a little disclaimer in there, or a little caveat, and said, much like how, the royal families of Europe would, marry their daughter off to some other son, so then they had allies to link up with later.
Right. But one of the other things that was interesting is, at one point, one of the people she was talking to mentioned how they were married, but her dad made him, and this was a confusing way it was written, her dad made her divorce her husband because he believed that the husband was actually Geronimo's kid and not the kid of the who was supposedly his dad, and that would have made them related.
Yep.
Right. And so strict cultural forbid that, because with that few of a people, if you don't have those things in place, you will end up with incest. So you have to interbreed with the other tribes, right? You have to. Sometimes it's done peacefully.
Yeah.
But then if you're at war, it's done with a lot of stealing and raping and you know, raising their kids to be yours.
The other thing, and I don't know, I don't know if anybody else got to this part in the book yet, but they were talking about like slave women when they were talking about Cochise's wife, or was it Cochise's wife?
I think so.
And how she had like slave women, like 3 or 4 women.
Yeah, that was earlier on. Yeah,
that was at the very beginning of the book.
No, it was Jew's wife had slaves.
Ho's wife.
Ho, Jew, Ho, whatever. It was J-U-H.
Yeah.
Jew, Ho.
I don't know.
I'm not saying him Ho. It doesn't sound. It seems.
It said Ho.
That's Huawei. Yeah. So I'm gonna say Jew.
Okay. So anyway, but they mentioned that at the beginning of the book, and I haven't had another mention of that later on so far.
I think because things were going poorly, so they had less slaves.
Then who were the slaves? Were they
Captives.
white? Were they okay? Fellow Native Americans or white women or Mexican women or
all of the above?
Just anybody?
Yeah.
Oh.
When you go raiding, you kill the dude. If you shoot the wife, okay. But if you don't, you take her. Now she's either a wife or a slave.
Well, you had to,
right? That's kind of how it worked.
But then you have a camp full of
slavery is just as old as time.
Yeah, I mean, humans are resources, right? That's more hands to get things done.
I gotcha. I just thought it was interesting.
It is interesting.
No, definitely.
And Jack, thanks for the point. That was a good one to talk about. You're right, David. When you're reading the book, it just constantly is talking about how this tribe, so-and-so was his cousin or his brother's wife's tribe. And it actually gets so it's hard to follow for me. Mostly because I don't think I had enough of a knowledge going into the book. I think this book kind of presupposes a lot of knowledge of Native American history because this is her later on book. She wrote this down the road. And I don't have that knowledge. And I'm picking it up from the context and stuff, so it is filling in the blanks as I get further in the book. But it makes it hard to follow a little bit.
Well, and then it jumps from like stories about Ho and stories about Cochise and stories about Geronimo, and it's like, and they kind of like bounce around in between chapters.
But as it's getting further into it, that's stopping, and it's getting more of a because Doc Lugie's getting older.
Yeah.
Okay, so the stories start to come directly from him.
Gotcha.
Which brings me to my favorite story that I thought, okay, I'm going to tell you guys my favorite part of the book, and then you guys can jump in with yours. Jack, this is your chance to think about what you wanted to say is your favorite part of the book. Mine is when him and Frank Mangus,
Colorados?
No, his son.
Oh, okay, yep.
Frank, which is hilarious because he goes, yeah, Mangus Colorado's son, Frank.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I'm just like, okay, that must have been the name they gave him, or maybe some of these tribes were giving them real English names too. I don't know. But him and Frank go to steal weapons from the fort.
Yep.
Okay. Matt, do you remember this part?
Yeah.
So they climb into the fort at night, sneak into this room, grab some guns. They can't see anything.
Yeah.
Grab boxes of shells, and they're like, well, these seem huge. That's weird. And some pistols, right? They get back to the camp and show, Mangus Colorado's son is the chief, not Frank. Frank is the grandson. But so they show the chief of this little tribe of them the gun, and it's a freaking double barrel. And they look at the shells and like, what the hell do we do with these? So the dude loads the shells in, the chief, and he shoots at the tree, and nothing happens to the tree except Doc Lugie says it seemed like the bullet broke up into a bunch of pieces, and they turn around, and the chief's getting up off the ground, thinking they did this shit on purpose, so they run. Right? They just take off, and then they see the pistols he brought. They're like, what is this trash? All right. And Doc Lugie says, and that was the first time I saw a shotgun in a 38.
Insane.
Yeah. I mean, just a great, that was the best story so far in the first half of that book, I thought.
Man. That's the best.
I mean, just humanizes it. They're breaking, they're climbing up the fort wall, going down, the sentry stops, and they have to freeze on the wall. I mean, it's right out of a movie. And you know what?
Totally,
it probably happened.
Oh, I'm
that shit
sure.
happened in real life. Now maybe he dramatized it a bit, or maybe not.
Well,
But the shotgun knocking the dude over. If you've never shot a shotgun before, and you don't have it against your shoulder, right, or something,
you gotta lean into
I
it.
could easily see that happening, right?
damn it.
Yeah.
And he's like, he's just so pissed. He goes, we knew we had to not be there.
Yeah.
And we ran. And then when he called them back to the finally after he yelled at him a while, he called them back, and they came back, but they wouldn't get close enough for him to reach them. And I go, holy shit, I've been there before. Dad's pissed. Don't get close enough that you can get hit, right? You come back, but just not in range.
Yep, exactly. Right out of arm's reach.
Oh man, that was funny to me. I really empathized with that story, right? I really could see that happening.
That's cool.
Scott, do you have a favorite story?
Yeah, mine was more like, well, first of all, it would have been, it'd have been another. It was another breaking and entering story. At the very beginning of the book, when they went to break their people out of the church, and they end up digging through the ceiling,
the mud roof.
Yeah, the mud roof, just to dig them out.
Well, no, they dug into the mud roof of the church.
Yeah,
and threw in the pepper bomb.
Oh, that's right.
After blockading all the doors.
Yep.
So they waited till all the Mexicans went to church so they could break out their comrades that were stuck in this other building, locked in.
Yep.
They threw in a pepper bomb. And it kills them all. Because if you put all those peppers and all that fire in there, apparently that stuff gets vaporized and it can kill you.
Gotcha.
That's crazy.
Well, yeah, because they did that earlier. They did that later, too.
Well, because he said, if you think that can't kill you, you've never been around one.
Yeah.
Right? And so they're all barricaded in there, and then they go break their people out.
And that's when they stole the mule with the gold and the silver.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's one thing, you would assume that since they had been around the Mexicans and the Americans enough that they would know they could trade the gold and silver that they didn't dig up for guns and ammunition.
And I'm sure they did. I think that story was something Doc Loogie said to try to highlight the difference between his people and the Americans and the Mexicans. And I don't think for a second that that's actually what happened. I was going to say that when Matt talked, and then I forgot. I think they knew that they could buy a shit ton of ammunition if they had that gold and silver. And if they couldn't buy that, they could buy food, and then that would leave them more things to get with ammunition.
Yep.
So, because there was always people they were trading with.
Yep.
I doubt that they just were like, oh, this gold and silver is useless. But I think it was an allegory, a story that he would tell when he's telling these stories to the kids of the Apache and his kids and grandkids to highlight what their culture was like before that. They didn't have money like that. They didn't think about gold and silver. Precious metals weren't important. Food and shelter.
Turquoise was, though. They'll talk about turquoise.
That's true. That's true. All right, Matt,
Jack
what are
has
your
a story.
favorites? Oh, sorry, Jack. Okay.
Just really quick, before we get to that, I like the raid story too. In the beginning book as well, Scott. There was one where they're sneaking in and they dude sees like a guy kneeling before a statue of their named god who's been nailed to a cross, and they're like, we would never torture somebody like that. What's going on? And then he sees his shaved head, and he's like, he's been scalped. It's just an interesting depiction of how one culture understands the other. But Jack has a favorite story here if you want to read it, George.
Okay, but Matt, we'll come back to that because I think that's interesting too. The two religions and the way they play off each other.
Yeah.
Don't forget the three-headed god.
Right. My favorite part, Jack says, okay, and again, this is simple Jack. He was in Tropic Thunder. My favorite part of the book was when they were going over a story about how they were camped somewhere and the White Eyes grabbed some of the men because some carriage was raided or whatever. The torture was described for how they were trying to get a captive to confess. He did not confess. Eve Ball then asked, where did they hide the stuff when they raided? And he says, you're pretty smart for a white lady. This is important to keep in mind because although many people portray themselves as honest people, they may not be telling a lie, but you have to pay attention to where they may be misdirection about the truth. And then he tells her, Jack, that was a great story because then he tells her, don't go looking for this. You might die.
Yeah.
Wow.
Come back.
Basically, that is still out there somewhere. And so that was Jew, I believe, who was getting tortured.
They starved him.
Or no, they starved him, and they threatened him and all that, and he just kept saying he didn't do it. But then Doc Lugie basically tells Eve Ball that they did steal that gold, that silver. No, Jack, that's a great story.
That was.
I forgot about that. I like that one. Okay, Matt, what you brought up I found fascinating because you can basically tell that Doc Lugie really does identify a lot with his God, which, how do you say that? Do you know how you say his God's name, Matt? Usin or something?
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. We're just going to say the Apache God. And
Yeah, sure.
you can tell that he kind of seems to feel a lot of similarities between that and the Old Testament God. You know? I kind of got that picture. But then when Scott was mentioning, then they were talking about how it got confusing when they were talking, or their three-headed God and all that, and the Christianity part of it. And that was weird to them. But when you listen to what they said about their God, it sounds a lot like an Old Testament God.
100%.
Right?
Yeah. And then, the God of warrior culture would be so, wouldn't they not?
Yeah.
I mean, everybody back then had to fight for a living, including the Jews, right? So,
but then
and you really need some emotional outlet, some emotional justification, some psychological justification for battle, for raiding, for survival, and so.
Well, what I'm confused about, to expand on that, Mac, what I'm confused about is they say, well, no Indian would attack, unless nobody would fight unless it was in defense of themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you
square the circle?
Yeah, how did raiding?
Because they didn't consider that fighting.
Well, but
even though you'd kill them, that was different.
But that means that's not in the defense then,
right?
I think there might be a distinction between anger and necessity. I need resources, so I'm going to take it because that's just how it's done. I don't like you, or over what did you have?
Well, I mean, all religions have hypocrisy. Yeah, Matt, you're right.
I think in the modern world and with our view of things, like war has just become generalized, and back then there were distinctions about how you used violence.
Right. But also, I think that was all religions have some hypocrisy, and you do see a lot of, I mean, think about it. The Old Testament, right? Thou shalt not kill. But it doesn't say thou cannot have war, right?
That's a good point.
Different.
Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah.
Otherwise, those religions would have died out.
Well,
they would have died out.
Well, that was the other thing in the book where they said, "Oh, well, your 10 Commandments is close to exactly what we have," but except for one.
Yeah, what was the one they said?
I don't recall.
I cannot believe this. So we're recording this in my basement.
That's a good one, though.
Okay. Yeah.
What was the one of the commandments that they didn't follow?
And Jack, you're right. It was Usen. Ussen was the god of the Apache. Thank you. No, there was one of the 10 Commandments that they didn't. They said, except for this one.
Yep. I'm trying to figure out which one that was.
I can't remember. This is why we're not Dan.
10 Commandments.
Well, I mean, Matt, did you just say what are the 10 Commandments?
Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal.
Covet thy neighbor's wife.
You shall have no other gods before me. Does that sound like an Apache
that wasn't
thing?
the one. No.
You shall not make
the Sabbath. Thanks, Jack. Jack coming through again.
Sabbath. There you go. Yeah.
The Sabbath.
Okay, so next time we're gonna get Jack on the frickin' stage because he's definitely carrying this podcast.
Jack, I don't know where you live, but what do you do?
Carrying the podcast. I like it. Maybe it helps because he doesn't have to think about talking all the time, and he's just looking through his notes and ignoring us most of the time. And they say, "Oh, I know this answer."
Well,
or maybe he's a savant like his character in Tropic Thunder.
You make me happy.
Never know, folks.
Oh man. That's
Okay.
a good movie.
So let's go with some final thoughts of the book. We should wrap this up before we talk forever. Because we have a whole nother section of this book to talk about soon.
Yep.
So we'll
When
set
are we doing
that. We'll set that for another 3 or 4 weeks just to give everybody time to read it. Meantime, we're going to be doing a Rest History podcast about the Rest History Aztec. So it's kind of like here we're seeing the end of the Indian Wars, and now we're going to go back to the start, right? Which, why the hell not? That's awesome. And if you haven't listened to that podcast series,
folks, if you're listening, I am stoked about this. This is absolutely fascinating. Not only just the general subject I've read about, but the way it's portrayed by the rest of history, which we'll be reviewing their perspective primarily, I suppose. I am very excited about this.
Hell yeah. And so good.
And Jack, if you haven't heard or if you listened to our podcast with Daniele Bellelli, I went back and listened to Sex, Saki, and what was it? So anyway, Ikkyu Sojin.
Oh, right, the Zen guy.
Wow.
Yeah. Wait,
I got to that one.
It was Sex, Saki, and Zen.
That's right.
Absolutely. I thought it was going to be way more graphic than it actually was because Daniele gives like a disclaimer.
Yeah, he lured you in.
He did.
That's clickbait.
He
clickbaited you.
I loved it.
He's like, I'm going to make it sound like it's going to be dirty as hell.
Like some
Sounds like click.
Yeah. I was like, well, I got to listen to the dirty shit. But yeah, some of the stuff he says was pretty.
I'll check it out.
Pretty fascinating.
That's on my list. I tell you, nobody makes titles for podcasts better than Daniele Bellah.
I don't. Yeah, and you're right about the intro music. Like,
it's dope.
I'm waiting. It's a western.
It's dope.
It opens up.
You're just like,
yeah.
Which I would totally.
I can't believe you guys didn't know that was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
No. I knew that it was from a western, but I didn't think he'd actually be able to use the exact.
I know it's always tripped me out.
Music.
As well.
Like, I guess he's just getting away with it. Nobody's saying shit.
I don't know.
Which is pretty awesome.
Maybe he's paying the right people.
Yeah, who knows?
So yeah, I mean, this is just a remarkable. I am looking forward to getting back to the second half of it. I'm glad we digested it in a chunk today. Thank you, Corey, for that recommendation.
Yes, great call.
Just an astounding view into a beautiful world, a savage world, and I don't mean that just, derogatorily.
No judgment.
I mean that it was brutal. And we need to realize this is where we come from. These are the things that happen. This is the soil that we walk on. This is our land. If you're an American, and if not an American, it's easy to romanticize all this kind of stuff, and it is romantic in the big picture, and even in the zoomed-in, small, intimate view with family and cultural life, and farming. It is romantic, and the warrior life is romantic as well. There's a lot of death and hardship, and just straight up nasty stuff in there too. Thank you, Eve Ball, for your work. Literally would not have a lot of this stuff without her, and I'm just so glad that Dan recommended it.
Yep, me too. Honestly, primary sources, I don't read enough of them.
Straight up,
I don't, and I'm glad I got the chance to read this, and I'm glad Dan recommended it. I remember when I first listened to Apache Tears, and I was like, "Wow, that sounds crazy."
Yeah,
and then I just kind of forgot about it. And then every time I'd re-listen to Apache Tears, I'd be like, man, that sounds crazy. I could never actually read the book. And then Dan called it out on our podcast, and I'm so glad. Scott?
I really don't have anything more to expand on this one.
Okay. You liked it. You're liking it.
Yeah.
It.
It's the only caveat I would throw in there is it's sometimes a little difficult to read, or it kind of bounces around a little bit.
That's why it's good we're breaking it up too, because it's hard to zoom through this.
Yeah,
I'm a pretty fast reader, and I have to take my time with this. So okay, a couple of housekeeping things here before we sign off. Okay, anybody who knows anything about Salt Lake City, please reach out, because we're trying to find a bar in Salt Lake City to host a live Talking Hardcore History trivia event the night before Dan Carlin's Salt Lake City show, which we will be at. We will be in the audience. Please join us if you can. We're going to have some giveaways and stuff with some of our upcoming merch, hopefully. We're trying to get that all lined up. And we should have that in place to bring with some of that stuff with us for the event. And So if you know any bars in Salt Lake City where this would be good, I'm just cold calling because I've never been to Salt Lake City.
I've been
So,
there, but I've never.
and it looks like most of the bars around the theater are bougie as hell. It's like gastropubs and stuff where you get a smoked bourbon.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't know that they want us in there talking shit about history trivia with them. They're in that fancy thing. But I'm calling anyway, so come to the Discord channel or shoot us an email at talkinghardcore@gmail.com. But please, the Discord channel is the easiest way to get us, which there'll be a link in the description. All right. Anything else? Oh, we're going to be doing another podcast. Matt's going to join us. We're going to interview one of the authors of The Long Hunters, which we've talked about several times. That's another early American, Native American history. And it's an audiobook only that the Meat Eater Network came out with a couple of months ago. And I've been excited. It's fun. It's a good read. It's only like 6-hour audiobook. And one of the authors, Dr. Randall, can't remember his last name, but he's coming on the podcast soon and to talk to us about it, which should be awesome. Dope.
That's going to be fun.
Because if you don't listen to the Mediator podcast, you should. It's a great way to learn about all kinds of cool stuff. They have people on there who survived bear attacks. They have wildlife biologists.
That Bear Grease podcast, dude, that has opened my eyes. I love that. The Where the Red Fern Grows episode alone was great. The stuff about Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett was great. I'm just about to get into the Mississippi River stuff.
Oh, I love that one. I learned so much.
Man. Thank you
so what
much
Matt's talking about is the Meat Eater Podcast Network has another podcast called the Bear Grease Podcast, and it's like a documentary interview / story where he'll go tell stories while talking to subject matter experts and then filling it in with like a voiceover narrator. I'm not doing enough justice to that, but he did a Daniel Boone one that was awesome. Davy Crockett, really good. He has one that came out now about a gentleman who poached a deer and how his life just fell apart. And it's like, I mean, like grown men crying and listening to this. Like that's how crazy how sad the story is. His wife dies, all this stuff happens. But it just started because like he was driving by his work, and here's this giant buck he's been trying to kill legit, and he's got his bow in his truck, and he just goes into autopilot. Even though he knows he can't kill it there, he gets like this locked in target acquired, and he just goes and kills this buck, and then he says as soon as he's down, he's like, there's no way I'm getting away with this. He just knows. And his life all unravels. He wasn't like a serial poacher or anything. And I like stuff like that because that can happen to anybody, right? Things can fall apart. You can make a mistake. And it's good to hear from the people who live through those things too. It helps give you empathy and perspective. But anyway, check out Bear Grease Podcast if you haven't. That's Clay Newcomb, and he's also one of the authors of Long Hunters. So it's good stuff. Yeah, that's going to be fun. Again, the rest is history. Start listening to the Aztec episode. Thank you for joining us for the book club.
So if you can get through it to like, I'm sure we'll be doing like a summation of all of it. But if you can get to it now before, I'd
go for it. They're like 45 minutes.
Listen to that. Just join us for that journey.
Right. It's like 45 minutes an episode, and they're like there's 5 of them. But holy shit, have you not heard the Aztec story told like this before?
It blew my mind. I've read about that, and geez, man, this revisionist stuff they're doing, or just really a fresh perspective, was enlightening. Straight up.
Yep. Put a lot more respect on the Native Americans in that, right? Like they weren't just pawns.
Yeah.
And it's silly to think of it that way, right? That's patronizing, really.
Yeah, there's two sides to everything, man.
Yep, we'll get into that. Everybody looking forward to it. Thanks for checking this out, and look for the link in the description for the Discord channel. And thanks, everybody.
Yep, have a good night.
Again, Salt Lake City
Thank you
bars.
for joining us. Have a good night.
If you run a bar in Salt Lake City, please come and tell us that we can host our trivia there.